Why did my mother just text me all caps yikes?
Uh-oh, what happened? Is somebody dead?
Nope, she just learned about a big dead sperm whale on Nantucket. Okay. I just got the notification that it was just like from my mom, no context. Yikes! And I'm like, everything's falling apart. And she just literally was like, there's a dead whale. I am so sorry.
The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections in Massachusetts. I'm Steve Koczela, president of the Massing Polling Group, here as always with my good friend Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and today is Thursday, November 20th. Today we're talking about rent control. The ballot questions are coming and folks are lining up on either side. Then, is there anything to the idea that congressional Republicans are starting to distance themselves from President Donald Trump? Okay, so Jen, this is our last episode before Thanksgiving when you go off and eat tamales and I go off and eat cranberry sauce. So are you ready for the festivities?
Yeah, revved up, trying to figure out how I can get out of the maximum amount of cooking possible and just align myself with an auxiliary, helpful role. I'm a big fan of, I'll try whatever you're making. If you need a control tester or anything like that, I think that's a really underfilled role.
You're nothing if not dedicated to service journalism, service of all kinds. So also, next week is Thanksgiving, and it would not be Thanksgiving if we didn't have Thanksgiving polling for you. So we have Thanksgiving polling. We have Thanksgiving polling that says there's actually been a change since last year because now apparently there's so much Thanksgiving polling that we even have to start doing tracking.
What?
And this particular... I know, isn't that amazing? We actually have a Thanksgiving tracking poll now.
All right, Steve, you've sent me completely cold two very exciting polling related Thanksgiving sides links. I trust you here. Who is in the anomaly? What is Massachusetts like? Why is it stuffing?
I don't know that you should necessarily trust me or this polling because this is actually the second year, at least the second year we've looked at it, of the Campbell's State of the Sides. So completely disinterested, very scientific researchers from the Campbell's Corporation have explored all possible sides and concluded that ones that they themselves make and where they, have significant ingredients are very popular. Even more people this year are saying that they'd even rather eat sides than turkey. So just, again, can't imagine there's any bias, any problems with the methodology, and that is what the polls are saying.
I mean, as soon as they figure out a way to put an entire Thanksgiving turkey in a can, I predict that the results of the State of the Sides poll are suddenly going to lean very hard toward entire canned turkey.
Yeah, they said, speaking of whether to eat turkey or sides, there was also a survey that said that 63% of Americans said they prefer eating the sides over the entree at Thanksgiving, which was actually up from 56% in 2024. And more people also said they'd be happy with just a plate full of sides. So I think the message here from Campbell's is that people should buy and eat more Campbell's products. So take that for what you will. There was also a map, though. I see actually in this thing, which I'm looking at for the first time, that there's a map. So it says it's the sides America can't live without. Have you determined from this weirdly unhelpful,
highly scientific map?
Yeah, like what Massachusetts is actually particularly attracted to?
We're a stuffing state. Very creative. Congratulations to us and the majority of every other state here, as is California. My other home state of Utah is my preferred one here, which is a good mashed potato. That I feel very strongly about. Mashed potatoes or any other variants of potatoes, a nice kind of like gratin or something like that. Best sides. Potato-based sides are the best sides.
I'd agree with that. I would say that because it's the Campbell Soup Company, it doesn't have nearly as many of the cool sides that YouGov did that one year when it was like tamales and like all kinds of other stuff that, the various cultural pockets of America eat other than things that, come out of a Campbell soup can. So Anyway, there is your highly scientific Thanksgiving surveys. Jen, we actually have a couple other things to talk about. So, what do you say we start first with rent control, and then after that, we get into some polls?
That sounds great. I'm personally infuriated that you didn't give me a big old bowl of mashed potatoes to work through as we do this for the most haunted ASMR anyone has ever heard.
Oh,
But, you know, rent control confusion can be its own kind of soothing background noise.
yeah, that's serious nightmare fuel. A sweeping proposal to bring back caps on rent and to impose them on all 351 cities and towns across the state has generated hand wringing, infighting, and one of the cycle's most fascinating political debates. So, Jen, you wrote not only those words, but many more in a recent story on rent control for Commonwealth Beacon. Everybody go check that out. So, we're going to go deep on this today. And I think, because I like order, we should start at the beginning. So, why do we have a battle over rent control at all? Why can't cities and towns just do whatever they want on this topic?
Well, it turns out we used to. For a long time, if cities and towns wanted in Massachusetts, they could have rent control policy. And so there were a handful of cities and towns, mostly kind of the big greater Boston area ones, that did in fact have some version of rent control on the books. So that was Cambridge, Somerville, and Boston. But in 1994, a ballot referendum, so, if your warning bells are going off in the back of your head, yes, there was an earlier ballot referendum before we talk about the current one. In 1994, there was a referendum in which rent control was very narrowly banned, like 51% to 49% narrowly banned, where the cities that had rent control firmly voted to keep it, and the rest of the state kind of said, on the margins, absolutely not, down with rent control. So that happened in 1994, and since then, there have basically just been a bunch of swings and misses to bring it back at even the local level.
Okay, so this law then, I guess doing some quick math, has been on the books for about 3 decades. And as I understand it, basically what that means is that anybody who wants to do rent control, or any city or town that wants to do it, has to go ask the legislature. The legislature is very often reluctant to do big things when cities and towns ask them to do so. What has their reaction been when cities and towns who want to do rent control have come to them and offered this proposal?
I guess whatever the legislative version of a shrug is, basically. So they've been weighing over time basically two different types of proposals. Either ones that are what's known as a local option, where a city and town comes to them and says, hey, we would like to change this policy. We need your permission to do it. Will you give us permission to do that in kind of a specific way? And none of those have been successful. Many of them kind of dying without a vote or dying in committee. So there hasn't been much appetite for that. Then on the other side, they've also been getting bills put forward by their other and own legislators that are trying to kind of change the policy statewide, either by just removing the ban, so repealing it and returning the ability for cities and towns to just kind of decide if they want rent control. And then other ones that would be looking at saying, well, you can kind of opt into rent control if you want, but it has to be at a certain level. So those are the kinds of categories of proposals around rent control that the legislature has considered. None of them, since we are talking about it today, and so you might be able to infer, has successfully passed. Nobody can do rent control without asking the legislature.
And with that reality in place, with the legislature not approving any of the requests that have been put forth, what recourse now have advocates taken? What are they doing now that would potentially change the situation?
So the funny thing is, this is now the second cycle in a row where we've seen a swing at a ballot referendum here. And as we've talked about in the past, and by the way, I should note, of course, my colleague Chris Lisinski wrote this very long, very detailed story with me in Commonwealth, but he also finished doing a roundup of all of the ballot measures that we are expected to see this cycle. And we are going to see a record 11 if everybody ends up passing the signature threshold, which we expect they will here. So that's crazy. But the reason that I bring that up is that there is a growing sense that when voters turn to ballot referendums, it sort of implies that the legislature is not doing what you would like folks to do. So, with that in mind on rent control, last cycle, Representative Mike Connolly of Cambridge started with a ballot proposition that would essentially just repeal the ban, that would allow a local option. You could do rent control if you wanted to do rent control. And that actually died because it fragmented the left, and progressive groups basically said there wasn't enough support for that question to pass. And so that did not happen last cycle. Some of those same progressives are back this year saying we think that there is momentum and we would like to go with a very different proposal.
And we should note here, too, that, of course, Mike Connolly is himself one of the, I think it's fair to say, most progressive members of the legislature. So certainly, within the constellation of groups and people that you're talking about here. So you, I think, hinted at some of the tension that's existing this time around. So let's dig into it a bit, because lots of these people, lots of these groups have been at it for a long time now in various ways. And it might seem like they would all line up behind the opportunity to potentially do something about this issue that they've been advocating for a long time. But as you write in the story, that really is not clearly the case. So what is actually going on between these groups in this cycle?
So to understand why there's kind of an awkward dynamic at play here, a little bit more complicated than just a fracture, it's important to say the proposal that will likely go in front of voters is not just a repeal. It's not just removing the ban. It's not just a local option. It's saying specifically that every city and town in Massachusetts will have rent control, and they will have rent control at the rate that you cannot raise rates more than inflation rises. So basically, and then it caps out at 5%. So let's say that inflation only rises 2%. That means the rents could only rise 2%. If inflation goes all the way up to 5, that's fine. It can raise 5%. If inflation goes to 6, 7%, if it's a cataclysmic situation, you can still only raise rents at 5%. That is very different from the proposals that many of the proponents have put forward across Massachusetts in the past. So for instance, that 5% number might sound familiar because Somerville, which put forward the most ambitious home rule proposal since rent control was banned, proposed basically either the rate of inflation plus 2%, but no more than 5%. So you'd still have that kind of 5% cap, but it means that in a year where inflation was 2%, you could still go up to 4. So the idea is that you give landlords a little bit more wiggle room, but you still have kind of an upper bound on how much that would rise. So that's the reality here. The most ambitious proposal that has come out of a Massachusetts city or town looking for rent control is significantly higher than this proposal, which would then apply to everyone, whether or not they'd ever wanted it before. So that's why there's this sort of tension about what the actual plan is here that they're proposing.
So it's basically that, just to summarize, to be sure dim people like me understand that rather than like allowing cities and towns to do what they want, they're telling cities and towns, this is what you will do. This will be the rent increase that's permitted in your city or town.
That's right. And that's why it's caused some tension with not just folks in Somerville, who I should note are saying we are going to back this. The thing to keep in mind here is that progressives, even progressives with quibbles for the most part, are saying, of course I am going to try and get this passed. Of course I want rent control. Of course we're going to go through this. I should also note they say rent stabilization. It's a little bit less scary. So rent control, rent stabilization, pick your poison, whichever word you want to use. But kind of an interesting bug in the ointment here is Boston. The city of Boston actually proposed the most generous or the most lenient possible version of a home rule here, which said the rate of inflation plus 6% or a max of 10%. So there is no universe in which the proposal that will go before voters would ever have overlapped with Boston. They would never say you can never go above 5%. So it's like if it's a Venn diagram, it's two separate circles that aren't touching here, which puts Mayor Michelle Wu, arguably the most prominent advocate for rent stabilization in Massachusetts, in kind of an odd spot.
So that then brings up the obvious follow-up question, given that Michelle Wu has been kind of the highest profile advocate on this issue, I think it's fair to say in Massachusetts. So how has she reacted to the specifics of the proposal that's being put forward?
In brief, she hasn't specifically weighed in on the proposal itself. She's been asked about this a few times, and the mayor's office also got me a comment clarifying she has no position on this specific proposal right now. But with that in mind, she has clearly said in public, on the radio, in comments, that she wishes that they'd gone with a local option instead, that the kind of details and nuances of every individual city or town is different. So what makes sense in Boston might not make sense in Somerville, or might not make sense in Marlborough or New Bedford or anything like that, or a little Berkshire town. So she said basically she was preoccupied with her election cycle, busy just grinding Josh Kraft into the electoral dust, and so did not have time to talk with the advocates about this specific proposal, but she wishes they had gone with a local option instead. So she has not said, I hate it, but she has not said what many other progressives are saying, which is, even if I have qualms, I will be working to get this passed. So she's stopped shy of that for now.
I should say that the risks of any ballot question are actually quite high, because one of the things that we've seen happen on other topics over the years is that when something gets put forward as a ballot question, if it doesn't pass for some reason, the issue is set back for years and years and years. Like, the legislature won't touch it, they won't pass it. Other funders are hesitant to, kind of resurrect the issue. There's actually, statutory limitations as to how soon you can bring it up again. So it's not like, okay, well, if this doesn't work, we'll just try something else. Like, there really are very, significant risks on, any topic as far as putting something forward in a ballot question. So let's then just turn quickly to other supporters and groups, because there are many others. How has the reaction been kind of across the coalition?
Right. So Homes for All, which is the advocacy group that put forward the ballot measure here, says that there is pretty widespread support. They have internal polling that they've referenced but haven't shown publicly, saying that actually there is a strong sense of enthusiasm around the idea of a statewide mandate in this manner. They have also locked up a lot of union support. So basically, very shortly after the Attorney General's office certified the Homes for All petition here, they lined up some pretty influential groups behind them. So we've got some labor groups: SEIU Massachusetts State Council, the Massachusetts Teachers Association, UAW Region 9A, Massachusetts CAP Council, like the list goes on, the Boston Teachers Union, that kind of thing. So they've all endorsed the ballot measure. And the reason that this is interesting, and the reason why the politics around this are a little bit awkward if you're a progressive right now, is we've just gone through a cycle where measures that might have surprised people did in fact make it over the finish line, in part because of the backing, or attributed to the backing of some of these same groups and the kind of grassroots energy that they had behind them. So what we've been talking about a bit in the newsroom and trying to kind of gauge the chances of this one is it more analogous to the efforts to bring ranked choice voting to Massachusetts through the ballot measure, where it was kind of a difficult time? It was COVID, the organizing wasn't sort of all there, and that means that they had to then wait 2 additional cycles before bringing the question again, and they instead turned their attention to Boston alone. Or is it more similar to the MCAS question, which passed last session, which, just in case you need a refresher, meant that you were eliminating not the MCAS test. The MCAS test still exists, but you were eliminating the use of the 10th grade MCAS as a graduation requirement. And so that got a lot of really enthusiastic pushback and a lot of really enthusiastic support. And it was basically put forward through the brute force of the Massachusetts Teachers Association, seizing on a moment when standardized testing is being viewed with a lot of skepticism, and that made it over the finish line. So what we're kind of looking at here is this a kind of controversial and confusing proposal that maybe oversteps and then could push this conversation back further than proponents would like? Or is this sort of a wave moment in which they can kind of grab that energy, push it over the finish line, and then the legislature needs to figure out what to do with the final result?
All right, well, that is the choice the state faces. Maybe the voters facing it, maybe the legislature facing it. But for now, the choice we face is, shall we carry on, Jen? Should we talk about some polling?
Yeah, I would love to talk about some polling that we can actually see in front of us. Let's do that. All right, Steve, it is your turn in the hot seat because we are talking polling. We are talking about polling because some unusual things have been happening with regard to congressional and other Republicans' actions toward President Trump. It's not all everybody is on the same side of the same boat, on the same ship, whatever metaphor you want to use at this particular moment. Specifically, just a few seem to be showing a bit more independence, and so that's kind of defying Trump on more issues than we've seen before. So, my favorite thing to do is I get to look at you and I say, Steve, what issues are we talking about? What poll out of all of the polls in the universe are we diving into today?
Today, we're going to spend a lot of time on a new Marquette national poll, actually. This is the Marquette Law School poll, which is a great poll that does a lot in Wisconsin, but also does a fair amount nationally. And they just released a new poll, which shows some really interesting things. And before we dive into that, I should also say that they're echoed in lots of other polling. So, we're seeing things from The Economist. We're seeing things from, lots of different surveys. Marist actually just released a poll showing kind of an eye-popping, double-digit lead for Democrats in the generic congressional ballot. So that's basically just asking people, if the election were today, would you vote for a Democrat or a Republican? Or sometimes it's asked, would you like to see Democrats or Republicans in charge? Generic congressional ballot polls tend to kind of lurk in the single digits, as far as the margin goes. This one actually found Democrats leading by 14, which I should note is quite far outside what the range of what others are showing, but definitely caught a lot of eyes.
So I think one thing that would be helpful before we dig into these specific polls is kind of situating at least me in what you were looking for going into this round of polling. Because we talked before about how there wasn't a strong sense about how voters felt about the recent general elections in which Democrats largely came out on top in most of the contested races. So what were you looking for? And then aside from kind of in a macro sense, is this kind of margin surprising?
That kind of margin would be extremely surprising. Like if we actually get to the day after Election Day in November 2026 and Democrats have won by 14, like it would be a generational earthquake, which would, realign the political system permanently. Like it would mean, or at least for a long time, like it would mean a lot, I mean, and there too, like most of the other ones are still showing Democrats leading, but in the single digits. What I was interested in, what I was looking for in this particular period were a couple things. One was, do Democrats start to like Democrats more? Because one of the things that was happening and why there were all those think pieces on the terrible Democratic brand was because Democrats were frustrated with Democratic leaders, and didn't think they were doing enough or didn't think that they were doing the right things. Whereas Republicans were largely on board with Republican leaders. So, Republicans didn't like Democratic leaders. Democrats didn't like Democratic leaders, so as a result, you had this terrible brand that got a lot written about it. So I was curious to kind of see, do Democrats start to feel better about their own party? And then the other thing was on the new issues that are happening, because there's in the Trump era, there's constantly new issues. It's like every day, every week, there's something new. Are there ones where Trump is doing well, and are they the important ones? Or can we really look at these numbers and see, oh, okay, this is why now Marjorie Taylor Greene and other congressional Republicans feel okay, like causing this huge stir, and why nearly all of the congressional Republicans ultimately voted for release. Those kinds of questions, I think, were the ones that I was, because I'm a pollster, looking for signs in the polling. Of course, there's lots of other reasons people do things, and some of them may or probably had bouts of conscience as well on that topic. But just from a polling standpoint, those were the things I was interested in.
Okay. All right. So we are in the middle of a number of very dramatic sort of turnabouts. Of course, this is about the release of the Epstein emails and files, ongoing redistricting fights, particularly Indiana. We've seen kind of the results of the California measure to kind of counter the Texas efforts. So all of that is in the background. What stood out to you here?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that stands out are two things. One was as I mentioned, wondering about, are Democrats gonna like Democrats more? And the answer seems to be yes. At least congressional Democrats. When you ask the question about, do you approve or disapprove of the job that Democrats and Republicans are each doing in Congress, and then break that down by party identification, you see that Democratic voters now feel better about Democratic leaders. So just to quickly cite two numbers, I promise I won't list too many, but the net job approval, which is basically the percent who approve minus the percent who disapprove, was 6. It was plus 6 in September, which was the last Marquette poll. It's now plus 28. Like, that is a huge increase in net approval among Democrats for Democrats in Congress. So that was one thing that was very interesting to me, and I think is reflective of the fact that people kind of like hanging around parties, which is reflective, I think, of the fact that their voters appreciate winning and appreciate standing up and appreciate actually doing stuff, which I think is more the interpretation at this point.
How much was the shutdown a factor in this, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's not something that helped Trump. The poll also included, approval numbers on a whole range of different issues, and it was approval for Trump, and also, who people blame more, and the approval for Donald Trump among independents, just to cite one number, was 14%. As far as how Trump handled the shutdown, overall numbers nationwide were 25%. Like, those are terrible numbers. Like, that's awful. There's no sugarcoating a 25% approval rating on any topic, particularly one that kind of consumed the country and the country's media and the country's political system for, weeks and months on end.
Gotcha. What about the redistricting angle here?
Yeah, redistricting is kind of an interesting one now. Just as a quick aside, after the election results of, these past couple weeks, I think it's less likely that we'll see quite as many pushes. And the interesting reason for our listeners on that is that basically what the kinds of redistricting that they were considering would do would be to take some of the safe seats on either side and move them a bit closer to the margin, but tilting into the Republican column, which is great if you have a year where Republicans are doing well. But if you have a blue wave year, like it looked like at least this year's elections made look like it's a real possibility, suddenly way more of the seats actually flip to Democratic that wouldn't have otherwise. So by redistricting, you actually end up shooting yourself in the foot if you push a bunch of seats sort of closer to the midpoint, which was, at least in some cases, what was being considered. In terms of overall approval, I'd say there too, not great. I'm just going to say not great. 71% opposition to the way that things have been going on that. 28% support for that. And even among Republicans, honestly, this is just not a popular idea. It's just not a popular idea. 30% support in this most recent poll, down from 38 in September. Support among independents and Democrats is down in the 20s and 30s. That's not the final word on this, because we still could have kind of an arms race if California gets in on it and then, some of the other states change their mind. But at the moment, I think it's fair to say kind of the shenanigan of redistricting is just not something that voters are into.
Yeah. Well, I mean, especially because the context here, of course, is redistricting happens. It usually happens when the census happens, when we get a sense of how many people have moved and changed across the states, population shifts, that sort of thing. The idea of redistricting, which is always a political process, in most states, this is in fact something with political ends because there are political outcomes, usually isn't pushed in this way for explicitly control of the chamber's political purposes. So I mean, that's part of the thing that's interesting to me. It's not just that people are kind of frustrated with the concept of redistricting, but this really is, like many things, taking something that we understood kind of happened every 10 years or so and, change the dynamics or the maps. You'd gain a seat, you'd lose a seat, that kind of thing. But the idea of the deliberate out of cycle process has sort of, I think, pushed this into the realm of kind of transactional partisan processes in a way that people don't always respond well to.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Like that's very well said. And I would completely agree with that. And would add to it also that even the every 10 years process in a lot of ways has gotten bizarre, because every state does it differently, every state's court looks at it differently, and it just doesn't seem like the way that we should be choosing like how to form our legislatures, either at the state but especially at the national level, where every state kind of has a slightly different process. That is a whole other podcast and or a series of podcasts, but what we can say is that the way that it's being done right now, the discussion we're having right now, is not one that appeals to voters.
Right. And then, the big ongoing elephant in the room is the release of the Epstein documents. Polling on this, do people care about this? It seems like Republicans are feeling a little bit more able to kind of go through with the disclosures. Notably, President Trump did say, just go ahead and release them. So there's plenty to argue about whether or not that's because he saw sort of like the shift coming and just didn't want to seem to have like lost basically over that, or whether he really wanted that. That is speculation on a person I do not know who is the president of the United States. But my question is, the people that are polled, how did they feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that that's reasonable speculation, since he spent so long fighting against it, and then suddenly, when it was very clear that things were going to go the other way, suddenly demanded that it happen. It's the old saying, like, find out where my people are going, so that I may lead them. It's that kind of idea. Information about Jeffrey Epstein is one of the things where pollsters ask, do you approve or disapprove of how Trump acted on this issue? And it was in the bottom three. So 26% approval, 74% disapprove. The only things with worse approval ratings were actually the government shutdown, which we just noted, and the bailout for Argentina actually was the other thing that was down there. But almost everything was negative. The only net positives were the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and border security. Everything else, immigration, tariffs, the economy, the Russia-Ukraine war, inflation, particularly inflation, very, very low ratings, 28% approval on inflation and cost of living. That's another one which I would guess in the next few weeks we'll probably have a podcast about that, because it's another issue which has been very important to people and just is not perceived to be getting better.
And I think I'd maybe wrap up this segment then with a query for you, Steve, which is, there's been a lot made over the years, for very understandable reasons, about kind of Donald Trump's resistance to political gravity. And some of those dynamics change over time as presidents enter a lame duck term. Whatever the speculation is, the Constitution prevents someone from running for a third term as president. So presuming there is not a third Trump presidency after this, what's your make right now about kind of how people responding to polls, but then also politicians, are treating kind of Trump's role as a central figure in the party to kind of shape direction or be worked around?
It feels to me, and I can say it feels to other people, just kind of reading other analysts and takes on this, that the era of Trump just getting whatever he wants is at least on pause. Like, we can't predict for sure that it won't start again, but the thought of something like the Epstein vote happening in his first term, for example, or even earlier in this term, honestly, when he had much better numbers, I think it's kind of hard to picture that, frankly. Indiana Republicans basically saying, no, we don't want to do redistricting midterm. That's, even though Trump said and threatened one of them with a primary, that kind of thing is hard to imagine earlier on. The Supreme Court on tariffs, like, there's just kind of more examples, it seems like, where groups and people who have been behind Trump this whole time are kind of at least showing some independence. And whether that continues, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
That's right. Well, we'll let's just leave this where it is and check back in a year for the midterms.
Let's do it on our 600th episode.
Perfect.
I'm Zainab Asma Doyle, Research Director at the Massing Polling Group. The Massing Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massingpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our fine food department here at the Horse Race. Very large department. They, bring Jen and I fine food on a silver platter at least once a day. But they've taken some time off to do this hard-hitting investigative bit. So Jen, what is going on?
Yep, big shout out to Boston Magazine for doing the roundup. As we discussed before, the pressing issue of our day here in Boston between the housing crisis and the cost of living crisis and kind of healthcare coverage and grant funding and education, all that. I mean, I know the thing that was keeping me up at night was why doesn't Boston have a Michelin starred restaurant? As we discussed at one point previously, through a discussion with kind of greater Boston, Michelin did decide to come to Boston, to the region, and start awarding stars. So Michelin has now recognized 26 greater Boston restaurants, and we have one single star spot and 26 that they say are good.
We've done it, Jen. We have done it. We have arrived. We got a gold star for our city's food scene.
Literally, I don't know, like a puffy, inflatable star. It does kind of kill me every once in a while when you remember that, yes, the Michelin Man is in fact the same Michelin that is handing out these fine dining stars. It usually, of course, involves, cities and towns being willing to kind of pay the guide to come there. So it's not, that they just wandered into the most lovely place in Boston and went, hark, we must recognize this. There's an element of we agree to participate and please judge us. And thank you very much. Include us in your guide.
I didn't know any of this. This is another thing that we need to do a full episode on. But for now, fortunately for all of you, that is all the time we have for today. I'm Steve Cazella, signing off with Jennifer Smith. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us with your favorite Thanksgiving sides at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to us here at the Massing Polling Group if you need polls or focus groups done. For now, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.